The story of James E. Pepper is really the story of a forgotten pioneer in the history of Kentucky bourbon. He came here in 1879 and built what was then the biggest distillery in the United States. I think that was the beginning of a pattern of going big and living larger than life that got him into trouble a couple times, but it persisted throughout his entire life.
This is a fascinating story to have a really once famous bourbon that went defunct and then to sort of have this random person come and almost accidentally discover this old revered brand and then to revive it right here in its old, original location. It just shows you how much passion and love there is for bourbon and how much history there is.
James E. Pepper's grandfather, Elijah Pepper, right after the Revolutionary War, he moved to what is now Woodford County, Kentucky, and he built a small distillery on Glens Creek. When he died, his son, Oscar Pepper, inherited it, and he significantly expanded it. Many of those buildings still exist, and they're at a distillery that's now called Woodford Reserve. James E. Pepper inherited that distillery when he was 15 years old, and with help from Colonel E.H. Taylor, he ran it till about 1875, got into some financial trouble, and eventually it was sold to LeBrow & Graham, who runs Woodford Reserve today. 4 years after that, in 1879, Colonel Pepper found some investors in New York that were in the wine exporting business. They gave him some money, and he built a distillery right here in Lexington, Kentucky in 1879. When it was built, it was the largest distillery in the United States.
There were a lot of bourbons back then, and James E. Pepper was one of them, and they really had this marketing thing down. In the early days of bourbon, it was really a common man's drink. And James E. Pepper was one of those brands that, they advertised in magazines, they hosted sporting events, they really brought the image up. And one could argue that was the beginning of the rise of sort of the perception of bourbon.
Colonel Pepper, more than anything, was a pioneer in advertising liquor, and he traveled all up and down the East Coast in a private rail car called the Old Pepper. They spent a lot of time at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan, where they would throw these extravagant soirees that were really like promotional events. They would invite people like Teddy Roosevelt, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, the Pillsburys, and he was very smart about putting his product or associating his product with prestige and, something that's extremely commonplace today. Colonel Pepper married Ella Offutt Pepper in 1890. They met through a shared background in the horse racing industry. The Peppers built a bunch of horse farms around here. The Offutts built horse farms around here. And when they got married, they bought Meadowthorpe Thoroughbred Horse Farm. They amassed a very impressive stable of horses. Colonel Pepper was as known in the horse racing world as he was in the whiskey world. He was winning a lot of horse races, but he never wanted to sell the horses, which is essentially how you make money horse racing. As a result, when the Depression hit, he got into some financial trouble. The distillery was actually foreclosed upon. When they foreclosed on the distillery, they also foreclosed on Meadowthorpe Thoroughbred Horse Farm. They actually came to the horse farm, seized every single one of the horses, took them to downtown Lexington to the courthouse, which is now our visitor center, and auctioned every single one of them off. Mrs. Pepper famously showed up to the courthouse. She wanted to buy her horses back. She was very unhappy. Nobody wanted to bid against her, so she paid $11 for the most expensive horse. She bought a few dozen horses, started her own stable on her own, and famously won enough money to buy the distillery back, buy their home back, and saved him from financial ruin.
I find my inspiration comes from Ella and how powerful she was with James E. Pepper, even though she isn't mentioned that much in history. So it's really that behind the scenes powerhouse women are really making an effort in the bourbon industry in Kentucky. And that's really inspired me to get more women into working here in Kentucky and working in distilleries.
There are certain brands that are so recognizable that they're almost synonymous with bourbon itself. The Samuels, the Beams, there are those that really were pioneers.
Colonel Pepper really was larger than life. He was an icon in Kentucky bourbon. He had this family history in distilling. that made him a recognizable name. He would have been like a Jim Beam or a Jack Daniels today, a name that everybody recognized. After Colonel Pepper died tragically in 1906, Mrs. Pepper, of course, inherited the property, inherited the trademark to this very popular whiskey, and she sold the company to a group of investors from Chicago led by a guy named Joseph Wolfe. He ran the distillery almost all the way through Prohibition. During the 1940s, whiskey experienced some turbulence. Through the 1960s, you hardly couldn't give it away. 1967, we ceased production. The same year, this entire place was abandoned, including the trademark to James E. Pepper whiskey.
To think that the James E. Pepper brand almost kind of disappeared forever if it were not this one guy who discovered it and decided that he was going to resurrect it.
Our owner, Amir, discovered the brand in 2008 when he was studying a famous fight between Jack Johnson and Jeff Jeffries. If you look at the photographs of the fight online, there's promotional stuff all over the place from James E. Pepper whiskey. When he saw the promotional stuff, being a bourbon fanatic, a boxing fanatic, said, wow, what is James E. Pepper whiskey? And sort of did 10 years of historical research, acquired the trademark, and in 2016, we moved back into the building. When the people that bought this property opened it up, they found letters written by James E. Pepper. Several of them had mash bills or recipes in them.
And are you using those recipes?
Yeah, we're still using 2 of the traditional recipes, 1 rye and 1 bourbon.
We had recipe sheets that they were running here, I guess that's been 80, 90 years ago almost at this point. For what we do and the number of people here, it's amazing. I look at it with pride every day that, we come in with a handful of people and are able to operate, all this equipment and what we can turn out in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, and at the quality,
I think what connects the old history to the quote-unquote new history is the actual work of making premium spirits. We do make whiskey. Aaron, Cody, Jacob in the back, Amir, they make whiskey worthy of the Pepper name.
So tell me about the flavors of your rye and bourbons.
Well, our bourbon, our 100 proof bourbon, is a high rye bourbon. So I think it's got a lot of the typical bourbon flavors, and you get caramel, you get butterscotch and chocolate. It's spicy, but it's also sweet. Our rye whiskey is 95% rye, 5% malted barley. So it's kind of sharp. It's got a minty sort of botanical flavor. It's very different from the bourbon.
Learning about rye for me is really fascinating because it's really distinct from bourbon. They're both whiskeys, but obviously bourbon is corn-based, so you get a lot smoother, a lot sweeter whiskey, whereas rye is going to be spicier, more robust. It's going to have just a more punch to the finish.
Rye's a much more flavorful grain, in my opinion. It's too much in some respects for some people. So, bourbon's got a little bit more of a smoother character where rye's kind of got that bite, that edge to it.
When people talk about bourbon, they always talk about the corn, they always talk about the barrel, they talk about the water. And the one thing I always like to talk about, which I think is the most important ingredient in bourbon, is age. Something miraculous happens to that water, that corn whiskey, when it goes into a barrel and it rests for years and years. You think about, sometimes I do this when I'm drinking like a 10-year-old bourbon. I go, what was I doing 10 years ago when this, corn whiskey went into the barrel and started its aging process? It really hits you that this is time passing. That 10 years is a long time to age something. So that's what makes bourbon special. And by the same token, like food, to me, cooking is not a convenient act. Cooking has to take time, and the more you put into it, the more you're gonna get out of it. We're here at the Old Pepper Distillery and just discovered my new favorite rye whiskey. And we're gonna use that as a base for a smoked chicken fried rice. I'm gonna experiment today cooking with rye because we're kind of making a Chinese fried rice. Again, a classic, but we're gonna resurrect it and update it a little bit. And I'm gonna try and throw a little bit of rye in there to give it that little extra spice to it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is make my marinade. And it's kind of like based on a barbecue sauce, but I'm gonna put a little spin on it. Basically, we're making a a chicken fried rice, but not any kind of chicken fried rice you've ever seen. We're gonna smoke the legs, we're gonna grill the breast, I'm gonna make a Brussels sprouts fried rice, we're gonna throw a little bit of rye whiskey into it, and put it all together and see how it comes out. So I fixed up this smoker with the flex rack system. It's a perfect way to do drumsticks. Just like bourbon, rye has its own special qualities, and the smoke that comes off the grill with that spicy, whiskey flavor in a recipe, I think it's all gonna come together and make a very unique, very special, very different recipe than you've ever seen before. We're gonna go out on a limb, but I'm pretty willing to bet it's gonna be amazing. I don't think there's any sound in the world better than hearing a sizzling grill. Now, normally, if I was gonna do this, if I was gonna smoke a chicken leg, grill a chicken breast, and saute up some fried rice, I would need 3 pieces of equipment. But as you're gonna see, I can literally do all of this in this one little space here. Every time you grill, every time you smoke, I guarantee you, you're finding new tricks. And I wanna show you one of my favorite flex grade accessories, which is the griddle pan. This thing fits right into that center rack where that center rack was. There's so many things, you really just use it as you would any kind of frying pan. Part of the joy of cooking for me is investing in the time and knowing that the outcome, to me, like if you spend 3-4 hours cooking, that outcome at the end is so much more satisfying and gratifying to me because I put that energy into it and that time. And that's what makes it special. And I'm just gonna dress a little bit around the plate. It's gonna have a nice barbecue, miso barbecue flavor. All right, so here it is. Smoked chicken fried rice. The chicken was cooked 2 ways, all using the hickory pellets. You've got your smoked legs, seared breast. You've got a bourbon-y ham fried rice, and a little miso barbecue sauce at the end. Enjoy. When you're cooking, especially when you're grilling or smoking, like you're there, you're present, you're putting all that energy into it, and I guarantee you'll get it back in delicious food, but there is an investment, there is a commitment that you make every time you fire up that grill.
I just a circus and the freaks are late for work. Some days aren't even worth